Hey everybody, I am here with Victor once again for some more Dungeons and Dialectics. This time, if the title card was not obvious for you, we're about to get racial in here. All right. Um, I do want to start with a couple caveats, get them out of the way so that we're not being apologetic through the entire video. Just get away quickly. The first one is going to be we're talking about races in regard to D&D and how they use the term. So lineage, ancestry, species, if you would. They use the term races most likely because it has a much better fantasy connotation to it, where all those are more scientific. But we are not talking about just skin tone. We're talking about different beings and species and things like that. So please do not conflate that. With all of our videos, but this one especially because we are really going on a limb. There's not a lot of data that we're going to be discussing. This is very philosophical and game theory a little bit, little touch on game theory, that there's no wrong way to have fun. If at your table the way you're doing it is working for you, please do not take it as we're telling you that you need to get out of the hobby. Quite the opposite. If you're new here, we pose these ideas because we want everybody to either reinforce their ideas and make it stronger why their way of playing is good for them, or B, challenge it to the point where you go, maybe I should tweak what I'm doing just a little bit to make my game better. It's all a skill, and that's why we're here to discuss it. So don't take anything as a firm platitude where we're planting the flag. Instead, we're helping each other grow through conversation. And finally, to address the elephant in the room before anybody talks about it, is that obviously the conversations of skin tone, race, and all these things, especially in Western society, is a hot button issue. And we can totally understand that in your weekly, bi-weekly, whatever it is, session of maybe escapism and power fantasy, that you don't want to deal with the concepts of being either subjugated or differentiated based on some inalienable fact about you. If that is how you want to play your game, by all means, do not have it as an aspect. But what we're here talking about is anybody who wants to turn that into a narrative position of tension and talk about those ideas. So with all those out of the way, Victor, do you have anything to add on those three concepts?
Basically, just that your table is always your table, and nothing we say can in any way control or decide what you actually do. It's all on your hands.
Yep.
We are simply here to discuss and interact with ideas. And yeah, that's fundamentally it.
Okay, cool. Well, with that out of the way, we can get to the discussion proper. Did you want to start with anything, Victor?
Actually, I think it's better if you start because I have my retort, shall we say?
This one's a little different. This is not really going to be two sides butting heads, which are a little different. We're going to basically take my concept of what I feel that race is in D&D. For now, here on out, when we say the term race, we're talking about strictly in the D&D definition. Don't conflate it. What I believe the most appropriate and highest level of skill when playing D&D, how you should think of races. This is, my personal view on it. And my view is then that, and the easiest way is to give an example. I'll try to give a quick one. The idea that a creature who can live for 1,000 years, does not sleep, has innate magical presence about them, and has lineage from another magical dimension, probably receives information throughout the world and interacts with the world in a much different way than humans do, and how taking humans as we understand them in our world, putting them in D&D, and how they would interact with all these things around them. That race choices matter more than just the stat differences and abilities that you get for it. It actually changes who the person you're playing is and how they think. That is my concept and what I think of it. So maybe not necessarily your position, but what argument will you be taking up in this, Victor?
Well, while I do absolutely agree that races decide a lot more than just stats and abilities and effects, there are certain fundamental aspects, not only just with D&D as a game, but with us as human beings, that limit our capacity to inhabit a being that is not human.
We can't inhabit the alien mind.
Exactly. We can no matter how much we try to imagine the alien mind, we can never be the alien mind or know what it's like from the inside of it.
And if I'm not mistaken, we also talked about because we always have a longer discussion about like how we're going to talk about this. There's also the argument of what's the worth in there. That takes a lot of purpose and research and preparation to get into this alien mind. And is it any fun for your table? And two, I'm losing my second point, but basically the idea is it any fun for your table, and will you be doing anything with it?
Yes, yes, and there's of course, as we've probably mentioned at some point, the GM and the setting needs to be in sync with what the players and their characters are actually like. You can have, if the GM and the player have a very different idea of what, say, a gnome is, then that is going to cause frictions or misunderstandings. So that is something to have clear from the beginning, that what we are assuming here is not that there is different ideas, but that which one is what the different ideas, assuming they are shared, is like.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I do have basically a document that any interested parties, it's not something that I tend to just pass out to every player, because I don't want to overload players before they start playing with me. But if they're new to my world, and they seem like they're interested, and it sounds like they don't mind reading extra information about it before first session, you're an excellent example. I hand them this multi-page document that tells them exactly what the differences of my races are from not only the player's handbook, but in general, just gives them the idea of what these beings are. My dark elves, my drow, are much different than most other peoples. I take a lot of influences from different writing styles. I take a lot from the Dark Eldar, from 40k, and embed it directly into it. My dwarves are much different. My gnomes are extraordinarily different. The concept that I was kind of thinking about today as kind of a way to talk about this was my dragonborn. My Dragonborn are exclusively born of female dragons. That is the only way in my world that Dragonborn are created. It is a female dragon that polymorphs into a humanoid, couples with a humanoid race, and then has a progeny that is a Dragonborn. It is why female dragons are so powerful in my setting, because they can effectively create their best lieutenants. Their most powerful lieutenants, and that's why they are many reasons why they are more powerful than the male counterparts in their race. Talking specifically about dragons, not just the Dragonborn. And to me, this adds a richness to my world that's different. This is my world, and when people play in my setting, it becomes their world that they also tweak and change. And it's a writing exercise that people are like, hey, can this be something that we include in this race? And I'm like, I like that idea. Now this race is then altered for the future of how it tweaks, and we write it all together. And it's a point of narrative tension a lot, because it's cultural differences. It's, the idea, and apologies for the ranting, but it's the idea of trying to make sense. Why are elves not the most powerful race and rule over everything? They live for 1,000 years. They have natural combat capabilities. They're naturally magical, and they don't need to sleep. Like, think about an army that doesn't have to sleep. That's historically, that is a basically untiring army. Like, that is one of the most devastating things for armies. How have they not taken over? And my argument for my world has been the one thing that they lack is a drive. Because they live so long, they can outlive problems. They don't have a drive to deal with problems head on. An elf looks at a situation and says, let it die. It won't be a problem in 500 years. I'll just do some research in the meantime. Make the walls bigger. Let it die out. Whereas a human says, I'm only here for a little while. Maybe subconsciously they're saying this. I need to deal with this head on. And that's why humans are the primary race in my world, is because they have drive.
And in my setting, the High Elves, their approach is, we have time, we have sources, we have the means. Why fight when we can simply pull strings from the back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's of course you can have varying levels of how well explained these things are, but in terms of what they are like as a species or as humanoids or whatever term you want to say, they are, and I'd argue all other species that are playable are fundamentally a human that has other attributes added onto it, and
Yeah.
then we try to inhabit those other aspects.
I mean, that's why it's called humanoid, right? Like there's a race called human and then everything's humanoid. Yeah.
Yeah, because we anthropomorphize everything from the basic template that we understand.
Yep.
And then we try and paint some stuff on top of that template. That's, as I mentioned previously, the whole bells and whistles thing. People don't intend to simply pick a character of a race and not think about what that actually means. It's just that they, by definition, don't think of it from they don't think of it from the start because it wasn't a question that came up to them.
Yep. We've talked about it. Are you a human with silly horns and a tail? Are you a human with weird eyes that doesn't sleep? I think that's 90% of how players engage with the fantasy races. Would you agree?
Yes. And the reasons for this is simply not just because we don't think about it further, but because that is the starting point that we all go from, and then we have to add the other things.
And that's how kind of they were created literary. When we talk about novels, it's like, elves are humans, but dwarves are human, but that's kind of how they were formed. So I could
Tolkien based a lot of his works on the old Norse lore, and
which most comes from more Norse lore.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see what parts that he did use and what parts that he didn't, but that's not the topic here.
But I think it's interesting to talk about the roots of where we're at. It's not unimportant that I think the default position is how people think of it as human but. Whereas and I am arguing, and I think I've brought you to the cult, that we should reverse this, that we should think of them as what makes them not human.
And I want to do this so much, but how? How are we supposed to take this little human mind and put it outside of itself?
I think the intent, and I think the part here is that the intention means everything. I think if you come to the table and you show just a little bit, now keep in mind, every time we talk about role-playing and things like that, this is not to take a hold and basically run the entirety of every scene. This is something that you sprinkle in. It's the ideas of flaws and things like that. This is something that is unsettling, just slightly different and unsettling sometimes. An elf might react to a situation more often saying with pacificity. They might say, "Oh, well, why would we engage? They're a short-lived being. They'll burn themselves out." And the human's like, "Yeah, but our entire civilization will be dead and within 10 years if we let this happen." It's like, oh, I didn't think of it like that.
That's inconvenient.
Yeah. It's just concepts like that, elves might be a lot more slow to action. They have time to discuss problems, much like the Ents in Lord of the Rings. Like they'll like, well, we should discuss it. And it's like, well, they're banging on our gates right now. Like, but we got time. Because in my setting, and I think Forgotten Realms is a little bit like this, elves experience reincarnation. So death is not that's not a thing that an elf in my society fears. That's why they're the few that actually are military members. They're not reckless and sacrificial, but they believe dying in the name of their people and their lineage and the keeping of knowledge, because knowledge is the most important thing to them. That is the ultimate way to die, because you will be reborn and you can walk another life.
Yeah, so basically they're not afraid of it as much because it's not as big of an investment as it would be for a human.
Yeah, but also for my elves, grave robbing is a horrible sin in elven society, where humans, I mean, it's not great to do, but going into a dungeon or a tomb, a lot of humans aren't going to be like, they're going to be like, whatever, it's old.
There are bounds and limits, and the circumstance that can.
Well, it's the joke that's been rolling around on the internet for a little while, that at what point does grave robbing become archaeology? Like how long? Where's the line? And for an elf, in my setting, the reason why that's such a sin is because that could have been them in a previous life that you were robbing from them. Like this
The grave robbing never becomes archaeology to them.
exactly, because they lived those lives. Like, you could be stealing from me if you go into there. So it is a grave sin to go into an elven tomb.
Yeah. Now, if I may change track slightly for
go
a
for it,
moment,
please.
I mentioned not session. What am I thinking? Last time we were talking about, I mentioned the Warforged I'm working on.
Yeah.
And I really like the Warforged for many reasons, and the specific one I'm making in that setting, he is the first of his kind, which means that he has no prior model to go by beyond what he sees around him. And being a Warforged and having been created specifically for the purpose of war and combat, the way I'm putting him together, he knows very much everything there is to know about weapons and combat and that kind of stuff, but he doesn't know how to describe the sensation he feels when he looks at the night sky. He just literally doesn't have the words for it. Someone has to tell him how to describe it.
Yeah, because he's built with innate understanding, because that's what's been quote unquote programmed into him through magical means, but he was not programmed with the ability to kind of like input beauty or all the stuff around him, but he still observes it.
Yes, and that brings us on to a point I want to bring up, which is and this is a debate that has been going on in all kinds of philosophical forums, and it's not one we're going to solve here. But it's the nature-nurture debate. What is natural, as in what is simply a part of what a creature or a living being or a humanoid is, and what is naturalized, that is to say, what has become obvious but isn't by default a truth. Let's say, for example, if the elves in your setting didn't have an understanding of how to put it. Let's say when they reincarnate, they
don't have their memories.
They automatically possess all the things that they did when they died, no matter what you did with the corpse. In that situation, the idea that grave robbing is a sin is pointless, because it doesn't matter. And as such, it would be only naturalized, not natural.
Correct. It's the difference of the natural reaction to things rather than a cultural understanding of things, or kind of there's multiple layers to it. It's not just culture, but I'm with you. And I think
human beings theoretically could eat other human beings as long as they avoid certain pieces and still be perfectly fine. But it is naturalized and culturally obliged to not do that in any circumstance at all.
Yeah, and there's also all kinds of feedback loops when it goes into it. And I don't want to go too much into the idea. One, because I'm not terribly scientifically taught, but it's a little bit off base. But there's also that reverberation of the societal impact that hits then the biology, and then the biology reacts to it.
Nature, nurture, and culture in the middle.
Yeah, and they all feed off one another.
These are three elements that we cannot divide cleanly. We have no clear means of doing so.
Yeah. And I think it's great that you bring it up, because I think at the crux of it is what I'm talking about, of what makes these creatures different. They all have different biology, they all have different cultures, and they all have different ways of nurturing one another and how they deal with the life because of those two other factors. And I think that's what makes it so interesting, and why when you play a different race, and I will say that it has side effects in my campaigns. When I talk to people about the different races in my campaigns, they're like, well, I don't think I'm actually up to playing an elf in your setting, or I don't really feel like I'm up to, because it is an undertaking in my campaign to become one of these races, because there's a whole lot more involved into it. So to a lot of people that might be like, oh, well, that sounds awful, you should be what you want. But to myself and the people that are drawn to my games, this is a struggle that they embrace. They're like, this is an interesting challenge that I want to see. And I feel that our time at the table is enhanced by watching Whereas in like, I don't want to, throw too much shade, but when I look at online role playing, it doesn't have to be just Critical Role, but a lot of I would glance at a couple of the other channels and things like that do it. I could watch them for 20 minutes and I couldn't tell you without the little avatars and stuff that they have popped up what race anybody is. For the most part, it's almost impossible for me to pinpoint it. I would argue that if you looked at my table for 5 minutes, you could get real close to pinpointing everybody's race based on how they act at the table, because that's how we play it. So it's such an important aspect to us.
Assuming you know what the actual races are like in your setting.
I would
to some small degree, maybe.
Yeah, I guess I would argue that as long as you kind of understand fantasy, like you would get that sense for them, because
we understand that a creature, that one particular one is a different race, but what is the definition of, let's say, elf if you're not familiar with your background document?
Yeah, I would also argue that as long as you're familiar with fantasy races in general, like you've seen Lord of the Rings or you've played D&D, that you could get
recognize tropes.
Yeah, so like the elf at the table is most likely going to be very aloof and haughty when he speaks, and he's going to be very dismissive of the other races and the plights of other them. And I know these are stereotypes, but I think it's interesting to start with said stereotypes. And then the PCs are sometimes, and even some NPCs, are characters that break free from them, and that's what makes them doubly interesting, because there are characters that do those stereotypes.
Now, here's an interesting question to build on this, though. What is fundamentally the difference between an orc and a half-orc in terms of, let's say you have two players, or let's say you have a pair of twins and they are essentially the same person. One of them is playing a half-orc, no, let's say it's triplets. One of them is playing a human, one of them is playing a half-orc, and the last one has decided to play an orc, and you've relented and given them permission.
Okay.
Now, assuming these three are the same fundamental people who would do the same fundamental approaches, what will actually differentiate these three besides maybe voices and such? This
is a fun hypothetical. I like this. So for me, again, we're going to talk from my setting. There is going to be the human is going to act the most normal. And we're going to take cultural differences aside, because it really depends on how each one of these are raised. We're going to take those out. We're going to say they're all raised.
We'll take that after this one.
Exactly. Yeah. So the just natural, what they're going to get from their biology, the human is going to act the most normal. He's going to be the one that you feel the most empathy towards and understanding towards, because they seem the most like you. The orc is going to probably, ideally, is probably going to be a little less linguistic. They're going to have much more difficulty speaking. They're probably going to speak with a bigger jaw about them. Obviously, I'm using an accent that's not appropriate, but that's just my orcish voice. But they're going to have a bit more gruff and almost chunky way that they use their words, because they have the big jaw. Their form is different. Their natural language that they would speak is more grunts and speaking. And then they're going to have a penchant for brutality, rage, and primitive behavior. They're not going to have an inclination towards progress or creativity that a human might have, or like an elf might be very. They're just, it's not going to be their way biologically and how they react. Again, we're touching a little bit on culture, but I think there's a port to it where there's a little bit innately. The half-orc is going to have aspects of both in there. They're going to have that penchant for rage. Their speaking is probably going to be a little bit more akin to what you're used to. They're going to be that gray in that gradient.
Now let's take this example in a different direction. Let's say you have these same three players, same identical player, three characters, all of them human. Mm-hmm. One of them is raised among the high elves somehow. Mm-hmm. One of them is raised in a human society, and one of them is raised in an orc tribe, and somehow. Let's not consider the how, and let's just consider the consequences.
So this is going to be a much more cultural discussion, and I think the likelihood, there's a couple aspects, and I think that's one of the beauties of tabletop role playing is that you could really write reasoning behind a lot of, like, you could almost make anything happening with spending some time to focus on reasoning. But what immediately comes to my mind is the human raised in the High Elf Society would likely have a case of they would have a penchant towards self-deprecation, that they believe they are less than, because they are around these immortal beings. They would almost have this problem of feeling subconsciously like a dog among humans. And that might manifest in different ways. They might be very dour about it. They may also be very happy that they got to spend so much time with these beings. But they would
more like a dog.
Yeah, but they would take on some cultural aspects. There would be most likely a love for knowledge. There would be a reverence for those older. There's a lot of things that
A
you
different time perspective, even if they have a limited one.
Yes, because the discussions that they would be around in, and the knowledge that they'd have at their disposal if they were allowed to research would be so vastly different.
I once worked at a place where a lot of pensioners came, and it's interesting to listen to people talking about what was happening during the 50s.
Yeah, yeah. And it would kind of be like that, except for it's like a millennia ago 50s. But you would also might have this human character in a high elf society that is a lot more worried of death and wasting time, because they have been around beings that are effectively immortal. It's through not only time, but their reincarnation. They're not worried about it. And it's something that's on their mind a lot. So they might be anxious often. They might want to get things done, not want to sit around all the time. And it's this weird dichotomy that might come from it. Whereas in the Orcish society, you would have somebody that probably would have to be very brutal, that understanding creativity, none of this stuff is very important. They may even have a drive in them, the like human creativity, but it only shows itself in the way that they fight. That they were, because of their physical limitations, they had to be creative in the way that they fight and usurp power through their creative fighting styles that they generated, that they were able to outmaneuver, and just that drive and that intense focus that comes from a human in my setting, that they wouldn't be stopped. Their considerable weakness compared to the ones they're grown up around would not be a limit to them, and they'd find a creative way to get around it. But they would have a penchant for hate and war, because it was bred directly into them.
You used the word bred into them.
Yes, yeah, so...
And there's, even in a completely cultural discussion, that terminology slips in easily. Because these are not attributes that we can just say, this one's over there, that one's over there, that one's over there.
And
There's
also, language sucks.
Language is the fundamental limiter and inhibitor of what we can communicate. The day we can simply plug our brains together and immediately understand what the other one exactly means and wants, we will have made a major step. Until then, we have to make do with this.
And to get too deep, I don't even think when we say it, we know exactly what we mean and what.
That too.
I think once we can neural interface, we're just gonna fucking all go insane.
But we're gonna turn into the hive mind again, my mind or something. But So now that we. And these are only two aspects: the nature and the nurture / cultural norms. Mm-hmm. There are so many other variables and attributes to this. You could mention, for example, the idea that the one species growing up in a different society might feel alienated or different in that sense,
or might even embrace that, like we talked about with the high elf.
Embrace it, depending on how their surroundings.
They were so lucky to walk this life that nobody else has. So I think the important part that we need to talk about, because I think we've put up a lot of good examples and we've really done some good hypotheticals to put it more on what is useful to people at the table. If it's not already obvious to you, I think the chances at narrative opportunities are incredible if you start looking at races in this light. That you could write entire stories around just these differences. Now, I don't think you should write entire arcs around just these differences, but man, could you make some interesting character arcs on these differences and really kind of engage your players on walking in other people's shoes, because they have to. If they're going to play this race, they have to walk in a different creature's shoes. And it's a very creative process to be like, okay, how would and this whole line of logic really is epitomized when you look in Volo's guide and you read lizard folk. If you read all the stuff talking about them, man, it just reading that makes me want to play lizard folk so bad.
Yeah. And let's add another aspect, another circle to this little set of diagrams that we're working on. Tieflings and Aasimar.
Yeah. Okay.
First of all, what does that even mean? And furthermore, what does it practically mean?
Yeah, so Tiefling and Aasimar are a huge issue for me, because I have noticed, and I think I'm not alone in noticing, that one of the most commonly, maybe not commonly, but like every party seems to have a Tiefling in it, right? Like that seems super common, that at least one person's like, either can I play a Tiefling or I'm going to play a Tiefling.
Yeah. And the thing I want to point out about Tieflings in my setting, for example, is that there was a major, almost cataclysmic world-ending war with demons and devils, and people still remember that. It may have been 1,000 years ago, but almost everything freaking died.
Yeah.
So everyone had, literally all the races, no matter how much they hated each other, had to band together to just survive.
Yes.
And this still exists culturally and in the memory. And as such, the only places a tiefling is safe in my setting is either by building their own protected little societies out in the wilderness where no one else wants to claim the territory, or by essentially going into nunneries.
Yes.
By somehow entirely disguising their race and pretending they're something else.
Yeah. I think this is kind of the crux on whether you can know if this is a new concept to you, whether or not you think this is something that you want to try out. If you can look at the race of Tiefling specifically, but also Aasimar, they're basically the same thing, different side of the coin.
Two sides of a coin.
Yeah. But if you can look at Tiefling and say, yeah, you could just play a Tiefling. If like you say that as a DM or a player, there's like, yeah, everybody should be able to play a Tiefling. Then this probably, what we're talking about, isn't probably for you. Maybe you can try it, but this might not be something that you're totally into. However, if you look at Tiefling and something makes you kind of go like, what? Like, why? Like that's a demon, right? Like demons, they are... If any argument could be made for an entity of pure evil, something that comes from a plane of existence of pure evil, and then a kid of that, it depends on, what lore you're looking at, what a tiefling is in your setting. In mine, literally, the tieflings are basically the evil Hercules. Like, they are half of a demon. Like, there's no way around it. I know 4th ed and now 5th ed has changed that a little bit. But
and people have their own settings and definitions, but like I have to put in my player's guide to my setting specifically and with big bold letters warnings that in my settings tieflings and infernal what's the word tieflings and warlocks with the demonic pact will be persecuted even more than they would in a normal setting. And that is to make people take their default view of, okay, this species, it's cool, but maybe people aren't that cool with it in the world, and make them go, okay, maybe this isn't the best idea.
It's also a question of what direction you come from it. As a player and a DM, do you come from it from gamification first and then narrative second? So you make reasons why everybody's kind of the same. Like, a dwarf is a dwarf, but I want people to be able to play whatever they want. So, at the very least, dwarves are everywhere. So, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to play a dwarf. Same thing with tieflings, same thing with Aarakocra, all this stuff. Or do you come from it where I come from? And I think you're either come from there or are starting to come from there, whereas the narrative is placed first and foremost of it has to make sense. Now, if the party all agrees on starting in an area where these races are more prevalent, then we can do that. But it's all discussion back and forth. I do like 3 drafts of like going back and forth with characters, or rather players on their characters, and where we're going to start based on what their drive is and what they want to see. And it works for me.
Yeah, yeah. Like I generally in my setting, I specify what I describe when I do in my settings document is fundamentally what the culture is like, what the cultural approach and standpoints are. How does the hill dwarves differentiate from the mountain dwarves, for example? Yeah. That's a differentiation a lot of people don't even think about. They just think, okay, do I want strength or do I want wisdom?
Yeah,
which is an unfortunate minimizing of the what that actually means.
And again, it all comes down to, you say it's an unfortunate way, and I would 100% agree with you, but I guarantee you there's a lot of people out there that's like, it's not unfortunate, we're playing a game. It's a game. We got game stuff.
Yeah. And then comes the question in, are you trying to win at D&D, or are you trying to experience a story and I'm not saying either of these are wrong. I'm just saying you need to know what approach you have, and that should match and mix well with your DM and your party first and foremost.
I think
from that point on, go for it.
Yeah, I think especially after watching WebDM's Power Gaming episode, I think our next episode should definitely be about power gaming and the appropriate terms that go with that. I think.
Yeah, let's put that on the list.
Yeah. I want to talk about that. I'm excited about that. But I don't know. I think we're getting a lot of, while interesting, I think a lot of these are platitudes. I don't know if there's a lot of hard rubber meets the road ideas that we're throwing out there, more just concepts and how we think about it. And I'm kind of running on empty with anything that would be of use. Do you have anything more?
I've mostly made my points. The idea that we only have these human minds to work with, and that therefore we have to take the steps from that starting point. We don't really have a different starting points, no matter how much we try. But we can try and examine our assumptions and our approaches. As I said early on in the beginning, people don't mean to open the book, see a tiefling, and go, oh, cool, I want to play that, without thinking about what it means. But you can take the process of actually thinking about it, and you can ask your GM, does this mean anything practically, or essentially what are these things in the setting, so to speak?
Nobody's doing this malevolently from either side. Yeah. Nobody's like, well, I don't want to think about race as being anything because I hate that. Like, no, people are just playing a game to have fun, man. Like,
as I believe I said to you at some point, the entire advertisement industry and the entire business model of Vegas is based around the idea that you just go for the thing that shines and make the funny noises.
Yeah, and the tiefling's the shiniest and noisiest of all of them. It's got the horns and the tail and the beautiful pastel skin tones. So
yeah, and that is not to say that the people who I was about to say fall for, and that's not my intended
bad connotation. Yeah.
Yes, but I'm not saying that that doing that makes the player in any way less, I don't know, intellectual or thoughtful or whatever. It is sort of the norm, and it's worth thinking about what is a norm and why is a norm and why do I follow it?
Because at the very least, if you're like, no, I like it this way, you now hopefully are talking about and understanding why you like it this way, and it will enhance your game.
Indeed.
Yeah, man. I think that's all I got. What about you, man?
No, we can get into the power gaming stuff at some point, but yeah.
We'll do that. That'll be next week's one. But thank you all so much for watching. I had a lot of fun with this one. I'm interested to see what everybody else thinks about this, because this is probably one of the topics that's near and dear to me the most, and it's something that I still feel like I'm an amateur at, where I still don't have a very good grasp on the idea of species in D&D and getting into their skin. It's about the only thing that excites me to be a player so that I have more chances to do this. But then I always remember as a DM, I could be all of these races, so I don't care. Um, so, um, but please take this as an idea to increase your narrative strength in your stories. And even if you end up not liking it and backpedaling on it, hopefully, or if you don't even try it, hopefully this discussion was at least enjoyable and thought-provoking for you. As always, I want to thank Victor. You are my rock in these. You make these things happen. If it were left up to just me and you not message me, I'd probably just be in a shower thinking about these concepts without ever voicing them. So you do make my thinking better because I have to defend them.
And I enjoy our interactions very much, buddy.
Yeah, man. All right. Aside from all that kissy stuff. Thank you all for watching. You guys are the best. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
And I'll be in the comments.
Yes, always. Later on.